Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Nicol. I'm a marketing executive here at Sutton Winston, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our latest risk management webinar, which is all about breaking down barriers to effective health and safety in the motor trade. So leading today's webinar will be Martin Coppard, who is our Risk Management Director of Sutton Winston Consultancy Services. But before we get started, I just wanted to go through a bit of housekeeping. So today's session is due to last around about 30 to 35 minutes, after which I'll be coming back in to join Martin for a live Q&A session. So talking of Q&A, please feel free at any point throughout today's webinar to submit a question. We'd love to hear from you. To do this, please just use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can at the end of today's session. And after the webinar, so tomorrow, you'll receive an email from us thanking you for joining us, as well as a link to a live recording, which we encourage you to share with any colleagues who might be of interest to them, as well as Martin's contact details should you want to get in touch for more information about how we can help you further. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Martin.
Good morning, thanks, Ben. Pleased to welcome you all here this morning for the webinar. Good to talk to you. I'm Martin Coppard, Director of Sutton Winston Consultancy Services. I'm a chartered insurance risk manager. I've been working in both insurance and health and safety risk management now for a number of years. I've got about 20 years or so experience now working quite heavily in the motor trade, in both insurance and safety disciplines. But I've worked with everything really from small backstreet single site workshops up to main dealers with multiple sites, both cars and commercial vehicle dealerships, and also been involved in agricultural and forestry plant as well. So I think I've got a pretty good understanding of some of the challenges in the trade, and certainly I'm kind of well versed in the common health and safety problems that crop up. So a few things to cover today in our webinar. We're going to start with a very quick overview of the motor trade sector in the UK, just a few facts and figures to lead into the safety topics that we're going to be talking about. Barriers to effective health and safety, looking at why sometimes it just doesn't work as well as it should do, why people or organisations have difficulty in achieving an effective health and safety system in their workplace, and look at fundamentally why it makes sense to give time and effort to health and safety, why it's in our interests to consider it. We're then going to run through 4 or 5 common hazards that crop up in the motor trade, and talk about where they arise, why they're a problem, and suggest 1 or 2 ways of tackling them, before finishing off with a bit of a plan, perhaps for next steps, things you could do to try and improve your health and safety system, and obviously taking some questions from you at the end. So just briefly, a few stats here on the screen to summarise the motor trade sector in the UK, specifically in terms of health and safety. Around about 200,000 people employed in the sector at the moment. Over half of those are employed in small to medium-sized workplaces. We see approximately 7,000 injuries in the last 5 years, 33 fatalities also in the last 5 years. And of those unfortunate fatalities, 50% of them involve someone being struck by a moving vehicle or hit by a moving or falling object, which is interesting to note. And then finally, 1/3 of all non-fatal injuries in some way relate to lifting or handling. And we're going to be talking about manual handling a little bit later on. Okay, so what are the barriers to effective health and safety? I've put some thoughts together here. which summarise my view fairly succinctly. Starting obviously with time. I mean, let's face it, we're all pretty time poor, aren't we? Not many of us have much time on our hands in the average working week. And from my experience, health and safety sometimes gets knocked down the pecking order on people's to-do lists when more pressing or immediate operational priorities come about. And particularly in the smaller businesses, owner-managed businesses where the senior management are effectively hands-on, it can be quite difficult sometimes to find the time to devote to kind of stepping back and thinking about health and safety. And that ties in really with resource. Again, larger organizations may well have or should have an appointed health and safety manager. But in a smaller business, often you'll have someone who kind of deals with health and safety alongside a lot of other things, other areas of compliance like environmental issues, transport, operations, etc., HR perhaps, and that there isn't the quantity of resource within the workforce to, again, effectively devote time to health and safety. Knowledge is also a barrier that I see quite a lot. Often there is nobody in an organisation that's actually qualified in health and safety management, even to an IOSH level, sort of level 2 qualification. And this is a problem because there is a legal requirement to actually have access to competent advice on health and safety, and often organisations don't. Some organisations obviously contract with outside parties like Sutton Winson, but many don't, and there just isn't anyone within the organisation or attached to the organisation that's available to kind of point them in the right direction in terms of what they should be doing and how they should be discharging their health and safety responsibilities. Recruitment is an issue that I'm again hearing about quite a lot from many of my clients. They are struggling to get and retain good workshop technicians, particularly in the commercial vehicle area, I'm finding. And what that means is that sometimes if you've got a workforce which is partly comprised of technicians which, let's say, perhaps aren't the most desirable in the market or the perfect people to fill the roles, what you've got there is perhaps an increase in the potential for mistakes or lapses or errors, and that can lead to, obviously, to accidents occurring, and the cost and disruption that come with that. And obviously also, if you've got a number of gaps that need to be filled, a number of roles that aren't filled, other people in the organisation are going to be pretty busy, and when people are very busy, again, housekeeping is likely to slip. Perhaps people will cut corners a little bit to try and get work done. And again, that can lead to accidents and incidents occurring. Finally, I've put apathy on there because I think this is often not talked about enough, frankly. I think too many organisations are of the view that we're fine. We haven't had any accidents. A serious accident will never happen to us. It's something that happens to other people. Well, I mean, I can tell you that one of my biggest challenges is getting people to think about health and safety proactively before something nasty happens, and investing the money and time in dealing with it up front, because I can tell you, again, from experience, from those organisations that have had a serious accident, after something like that happens, health and safety becomes their #1 priority, and it's kind of at the top of the agenda at that point. But unfortunately, by then someone's been hurt, the organisation may have incurred a fine or prosecution, and the horse has already bolted, so to speak. And don't just assume that because you've had no accidents that your health and safety is in good order. I mean, you could be lucky, but also are accidents even being reported? Sometimes underreporting is a big issue, and there are underlying problems that go unaddressed because management aren't aware of what's happening day to day. So, I mean, why should we bother with this health and safety thing? We've got so many other priorities, so many other things that need to be done. What's in it for us, so to speak, as organizations? Well, apart from the obvious, which is creating a safer work environment, preventing people from getting hurt, there's another number of other reasons to spend time on health and safety. From a moral point of view, we don't want to see our colleagues or our workers come to harm. Nobody wants to see that. So it makes sense to keep the working environment as safe as possible. But from a legal point of view, obviously we've got criminal and civil aspects to consider here. If we break the law, we risk fines, prosecutions. But from a civil angle, if someone's injured in the workplace, they may choose to take an action for compensation against their employer. Okay, we'll have some insurance against the compensation awards, but there's all sorts of indirect costs that come with having accidents that insurance won't pick up, particularly all the administrative costs that come with, dealing with insurance companies, dealing with HSE inspector visits, covering staff or paying for staff overtime, not to mention reputational damage and other things that come with it. From the point of view of the third item there, operational efficiencies, I tend to find that organizations that do safety well tend to be pretty high quality organizations. I mean, think about it. If you've got your housekeeping in really good order, then people are going to be able to find things that they need quickly and effectively, and they're going to be able to work in a fairly slick manner. If they keep their machinery and tools in good order and keep staff trained regularly, then again, that's going to improve productivity. If their working environment is pleasant and clean and taken care of, then that's going to make staff, it's going to improve their well-being, and they're going to be more inclined to kind of engage with the company values and company goals. So good safety often does equal good quality as well. Reducing costs, as I've mentioned, accidents incur costs, not just the direct costs of fines and compensation awards to injured employees, but increased insurance premiums, staff overtime to cover lost work, costs involved in reviewing risk assessments, loss of managers' time in getting involved with all the paperwork that comes with accidents. The list goes on. So we can actually improve the profitability of our organisation by avoiding all these costs that come with accidents, and protect our reputation at the same time. And that's going to help. If we've got a reputation for being a high quality, safety conscious business, we're going to be able to attract and hopefully retain the best technicians that are available on the market. They will want to work for our organisation. And I've already touched on the fact that recruitment of good technicians has been a challenge for many companies in recent years. And finally, as I've touched on insurance premiums, if employees are being injured, they're suing the company for compensation. If your employer's liability insurance pays out, obviously your insurers are going to want to get their money back. So it's going to have a knock-on effect on your future insurance premiums. Okay. I mean, often I spend time talking to finance directors in organizations. I don't just deal with health and safety managers. And I think it's good to make the case as to why health and safety can actually pay for itself and more. And I've done this using something called the iceberg principle. And there's 3 different strands to this. Firstly, it's always cheaper to invest proactively in improving health and safety rather than facing the unexpected costs and disruption of an accident or a visit from the HSE or an environmental health officer. I worked with one client in recent years who, we were trying to persuade them to engage us to help them with their risk assessments and some of their other policies and procedures because we felt they needed some attention. They put it off. They then had a visit from the HSE and was served with an improvement notice and incurred costs of around about £6,000, whereas the cost of actually dealing with the things that we'd identified in advance were around about £2,000. So that just illustrates the point there. But secondly, the relationship between insured and uninsured costs following an accident lie in the range of between 1 to 8 and 1 to 36. Now that's an HSE statistic, and it is a fairly broad range. But the key point here is that it's not sensible to rely on insurance as your catch-all to deal with the costs that come from accidents. Yes, insurance will pay compensation awards if an employee is injured and successfully sues the organisation, but it's not going to cover, retraining expenses, staff overtime, lost orders, loss of shareholder value, all the loss of management time in dealing with the paperwork, etc. So it's not a good idea to rely on insurance. I think, oh, we'll be fine if we have an accident because we're insured, because it certainly isn't the total solution. And then finally, a sort of positive spin, if you like, on the theme. A study was done of the Olympic Park construction in London a few years ago, which found that the return on investment from money spent on preventing illness amongst the workforce could be as high as £7 for every £1 spent. The people organising the construction invested quite a lot of money to try and promote the well-being of the workforce, try and keep them healthy, try and keep them in work, keep them attending every day. Obviously, that construction had to be completed to fairly tight deadlines. And what they didn't want was a lot of people being off work regularly, which was going to potentially jeopardize them being able to complete on time. So they invested some money proactively on supporting their workforce, trying to keep them happy and healthy. And they reckon the payback from that was around about £7 for every £1 spent. So that was quite a telling statistic, I think. Okay, I'm going to touch on a handful of specific hazards in the motor trade now. I mean, each one of these is a big subject on its own, so we will kind of cover off broadly where they apply, where they can arise, and suggest some solutions that you might want to consider. Starting with workplace transport initially. And this is an important one, and I put this first because it ties in, I think, quite nicely with the statistic on an earlier slide, in that it's about 50% of fatal accidents in the motor trade involve someone being struck by a moving vehicle or a moving object. And I often find when I'm out and about seeing dealerships and motor trade premises that space is often limited. I see a lot of congested yards, vehicles having to be moved regularly because they're being blocked in, inadequate parking. And this is a challenge, particularly if you've got a lot of people around, if you've got a lot of pedestrian movement in areas where vehicles are present. Well, you could say there's a fairly high likelihood of a collision occurring at some point. And as we all know, the consequences of a vehicle and pedestrian collision usually are quite serious. So it's a high risk activity. And if you've got limited space, limited visibility, limited parking, you need to be considering this pretty carefully. The risk can be exacerbated by things like poor lighting. If there's no particular pedestrian vehicle separation, again, that's going to exacerbate the chance of a collision occurring. For visitors and customers coming in, if they can't see where they've got to go, if they can't make out the visitors parking, that could lead to them kind of just cruising around the premises aimlessly, looking around for signs and perhaps not paying attention to the road immediately in front of them. Disorderly or poorly parking arrangements. I've seen a lot of sites where you've got vehicles parked over walkways or exits being blocked. And this is an ongoing problem for a lot of dealerships which are sort of outgrown their premises effectively. But also where you've got regular reversing. And reversing is not ideal from a health and safety point of view. Ideally, what you want is a site where you can apply a one-way system so vehicles can kind of drive in and out of the site without having to reverse. But obviously in the real world, in reality, reversing is a regular factor, and that's a cause of many accidents, unfortunately. And then finally, entering the site at speed. If people are coming off a busy main road and shooting into the site, they might not be expecting to see kind of people in their vicinity, pedestrians around. So that could be a problem. So when we're thinking about workplace transport, I mean, some of the solutions that I would be advising clients to consider, I mean, first and foremost, fundamentally, try and keep people and vehicles apart. That's the key thing to do. I mean, ideally, you want completely separate barriered walkways, but again, in reality, it's not always possible. So at the very least, very clearly marked pedestrian walkways to keep people away from the key vehicle movement areas, and so that drivers of vehicles know where they can expect to see pedestrians wandering around. It might be that you can timetable some deliveries and things coming into site. If you can perhaps, if you've got shift times where people are coming in at 9 o'clock, leaving at sort of 2 in the afternoon, and then people are coming in for the next shift at that point, and then leaving later on in the evening, perhaps try and timetable major deliveries onto the site away from those times, so you haven't got them turning up at times where there's lots of people wandering around outside. Obviously, look at lighting in external areas. That's quite an important consideration. Make sure that signage is really clear for reception, so people can make their way to reception without having to kind of search for it. Clearly define visitor parking, and please don't use the visitor parking for own vehicles. Keep it clear for people that are coming onto the site. As I mentioned, try and avoid reversing wherever you can. If a one-way system can be incorporated, if it can't, then you might need to look at banksman training for certain staff. Make sure they are properly trained, because often it's the banksman or the watcher that's actually hit by the reversing vehicle. So it does need to be carefully looked at and properly delivered training for banksmen. If you've got a particularly busy and congested yard, it may be you want to consider appointing a yardsman or someone that's just sort of based out in the yard to supervise parking, supervise deliveries, and just kind of keep an eye on people speeding and such like around the site. You might want to have a 5 mile an hour speed limit. It's normally a good idea. Again, clearly signed at the entrance. And then finally, I mean, a high vis policy is a good idea in a yard, but please don't use PPE as your main control measure. It should be your last resort. And yes, it's a good idea, but in conjunction with other more effective control measures. Right, moving on to pits, which are a frequent source of debate between motor traders and insurers, I have found over the years. The thing is that when you've got people working around inspection pits, they are technically working at height because they're working in a place where they could fall and sustain personal injury. So it needs to be treated like working at height. And if at all possible, you need to try and avoid the need to work at height. The fact of the matter is that some serious injuries have occurred over the years when people falling into a pit or falling during entry or exit from a pit. And it's not always the workers that are most at risk. They kind of become familiar with the premises. They kind of know where they are and what's around them most of the time. But it's often visitors, contractors, delivery agents who aren't familiar with the site that might be more prone to a fall into an inspection pit. So bear that in mind. And then we get on to this business about, well, what is reasonable to do? What is reasonably practicable when it comes to pit safety? Because people often push back and say, well, we can't cover the pit at all times. We'd be covering it and uncovering it every few minutes when a vehicle is taken off and put back on again and so forth. Well, at the end of the day, what is right for your workplace depends on the local factors affecting your work environment. There's not a one size fits all. So you need to be thinking about, well, what's the size of the workplace? How many people are around that could potentially be affected by the open pit? What level of supervision is there? Is there someone like managers always present, keeping an eye on how and where people are working? Are visitors correctly supervised? So you don't have delivery people just wandering into the workshop. Are they correctly diverted to the reception area, and such like? You need to keep the pits covered as much as possible. So ideally, some of the modern pits are great. They have these electronic sort of concertina pit covers that you can pull over nice and easily. But otherwise, ideally, a good pit cover is the best solution, because it means the working at height risk is gone. There's no longer a chance of a fall once the pit is covered. But if that is not feasible because of the number of vehicle movements on and off the pit regularly, then the next best thing is to make sure that you've got some good barriers. That could be chains, it could be those retractable barriers, tensor barriers, that sort of thing in place. They don't necessarily, well, they won't stop a fall, but they are at least a visual deterrent. You just need to be careful that with chains in particular, they don't hang down low, because then they can actually represent a trip hazard. And you need to make sure that staff are putting the barriers in place whenever the pit is exposed, or even when part of the pit is exposed. These retractable barriers can be used around any open portion of a pit. So that's important. And making sure that the sort of edges to the pits are clearly painted, yellow and black, hazard marking, so people can see where the edge of the pit is. And again, good lighting in the workshop obviously plays a part in promoting good visibility. And supervisors, workshop supervisors, make sure that, if you catch your staff trying to jump a pit, something like that, call it out. It shouldn't be happening. Make sure that staff know that pit safety is taken seriously. Okay, machinery, a little bit about machinery. We have all sorts of things in motor trade workshops: lifting tables, bearing presses, welding kits, abrasive wheels, nut guns, pressure washers, forklift trucks, a whole range of things that come under the machinery definition. When we're doing our risk assessments for machinery, we need to be thinking about both the mechanical hazards and the non-mechanical hazards. So mechanical hazards would be anything to do with the operational sort of powered moving parts of machinery. So things like trapping your hands or fingers, crushing, puncture injuries, and that sort of thing. Whereas non-mechanical hazards are other things that come from the use of machinery, like it could be noise, could be vibration, electricity, perhaps ergonomic type issues associated with using machinery as well. And the key point I want to make here is that it's really important that you can evidence that your staff are competent to use machinery safely. If you have an accident involving a piece of machinery, the HSE, if they get involved and investigate, they're going to be asking you, how do you know that your member of staff was competent to use this piece of machinery? You'll be aware that with forklift trucks, we get forklift truck drivers properly trained and certified and subject to refresher training periodically. A forklift truck is a piece of workplace machinery, and other pieces of machinery shouldn't be treated any different. You need to be able to evidence that staff are competent. It's not enough just to be able to say, oh, well, they've had experience for the last 10 years with another employer. You need to be able to show something better than that. Some sort of training, certification, qualification, something that shows that they are safe to use that piece of equipment in question. Planned preventative maintenance and inspection, really important. Keep an eye on your machinery, make sure it's being used for the right purposes. Injuries have occurred sometimes when a piece of kit is being used for something that actually it wasn't really designed for. So keep that in mind, and supervision of the workshop is important in that respect as well. Regular inspections, there's a piece of health and safety law known as PURE, which you may be aware of, the provision and use of work equipment regulations, that talks about the importance of inspection of workplace equipment and machinery to make sure that it's in good order, not damaged, and is suitable for use. You might want to appoint authorized users for certain high hazard pieces of equipment. You need to be thinking about safe systems of work. So a kind of a bullet point start to finish process for operating a certain piece of equipment, so that people can be trained in using it in a safe manner. Importantly, think not just about normal use, but also cleaning, maintenance, non-routine tasks. People are often injured at the point that they are kind of dismantling machinery or taking off guards, trying to get access to dangerous parts, perhaps to clear a blockage or something like that in a machine. And issues occur with inadvertent startup and things like that. So don't just consider normal use in your risk assessments, but those other non-routine tasks as well. And consider things like loose clothing worn by employees, jewelry, long hair, all that sort of thing as well, which needs to be carefully considered if you're working with machinery where you could be drawn in to dangerous moving parts. And just finally, a point to make about forklift trucks. If you've got forklift trucks in your workplace and they're fitted with seat belts, they really must be worn. I see that too often, people darting about on forklifts without the seat belt on. It stops you, or stops the driver from being tempted to try and jump free from the forklift if it's about to overturn. They're much better off staying in their seat, which is why the seat belt is there to be used. Manual handling. Manual handling is a bit of a dirty word, isn't it? I think in health and safety, it has sort of negative connotations, I think, attached to it, and people kind of yawn and moan and think, oh, we've got to be taught how to lift a box and bend our knees and keep our back straight, etc., etc. But as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, a third of all injuries in the workplace are in some way related to a manual handling task. So it is a significant problem, unfortunately. It's not just lifting and lowering, it's pushing, pulling as well. That's all classed as manual handling. In the motor trade, we've got a fair few fairly heavy duty manual handling tasks. I'm thinking about commercial vehicle batteries, for example, in parts stores, very heavy items, things like tires as well, and other parts that that are fairly heavy and can cause back strains and pulled muscles and things like that. It's crucial if you are unfortunate enough to have an employee make a claim against you for compensation following a manual handling injury at work. If you can't show two things, their claim is almost certainly going to be successful. You've got to be able to show that you've got a risk assessment for that particular manual handling task, if it's a task that involves a significant risk of injury. So we're not talking about lifting a kettle in the kitchen here. We're talking about our significant manual handling tasks should be risk assessed. You need to be able to show a risk assessment that's relevant to that task. And also you must be able to show evidence of manual handling training. That's really important. And that should be refreshed periodically as well, not just done once on induction and then forgotten about. And make sure that training is relevant to the manual handling tasks that are being undertaken. Don't just sit someone in front of a 20-minute VHS video of set in a warehouse of showing you how to lift a box, because it might not be boxes that people are lifting in your workplace. The manual handling tasks might be very different to that. So make sure you've got evidence of training that is actually relevant to the tasks in question. Wherever you can, avoid manual handling, mechanize the task, try and avoid the person having to take the strain. So, lifting accessories for carrying, pallet trucks, trolleys, wheeled cages, things like that, wherever possible. With deliveries coming in to parts stores, if you can get delivery people to bring things to the point of storage rather than just dumping them in reception, that's a good thing. Maybe you can get certain packages reduced in size or weight, potentially. which also is going to be of benefit to you. Think about storage arrangements in your parts store, in your racking areas. Heavy stuff, please keep it low down. You don't want heavy stuff stored at height. Keep the lighter things at sort of head height or above. And make sure, as workshop supervisors, make sure they are monitoring how manual handling tasks are being undertaken. If something has been designed as a two-person job, make sure that people aren't skipping the rules and trying to do it themselves. Okay, final one. On the hazards, I wanted to talk about workplace stress because it's becoming more and more of a relevant issue. And at the moment, the HSE are spending a lot more time focusing on health as opposed to safety. And I think over the last 18 months, with everything that's happened with COVID and such like, you know, well-being, stress, anxiety and such like are bigger issues than ever. Stress, depression and anxiety accounted for over 50% of cases of workplace ill health and sick days in 2019, 2020. And that's the official statistic. And I'm sure that there's actually more than that, because often stress is presented as other things like migraine or fatigue, for example, because people often don't want to admit to being stressed because there's still that sense of stigma, I think, attached to it. We tend to think of workload as being the major cause of stress, but it's sometimes it's not just workload. It could be working relationships, it could be working conditions, there could be change on the horizon in the company which is causing people to feel a bit anxious. And I found in the motor trade, when I work with service managers or site managers, often they're the ones that really, I think, probably bear most of the pressure. I find they're working long days. I find they're often on call while they're at home and under a great deal of pressure, particularly because as we've talked about earlier, there's often vacancies because technician vacancies aren't always filled. The workforce can be down a little bit in numbers, which means that people are extra busy and the site manager has to kind of chip in, get their hands dirty, so to speak. And that just adds to the stress levels. Obviously, when people are rushing around, feeling stressed, anxious, that's going to have a knock-on effect to things like housekeeping. Workplace monitoring might be delayed or not happening at all. Staff training might get delayed. So you can see that there's a bigger picture involved there. So it's important that senior managers and managers understand what's going on in their teams. They understand everyone's workloads. It's important that managers communicate with their staff regularly, whether that's team meetings, one-to-ones, or, you know, at the very least, every morning and evening, you know, how's it going and how did your day go? Just that sort of communication can make a big difference to people that are really struggling or under the cosh. Just gives them a chance to get their worries off their chest, which can be 50% of the solution sometimes. Make sure that work is allocated fairly. You might have a really good, competent technician that you're always tempted to give the toughest, most grueling jobs to. It can be tempting, but that can present an unfair burden for the person in question. Look at the working environment. If you can improve things like you know, the lighting in the workplace, not just the actual lights, but maybe the color of the walls, nice white, bright walls, and give a much happier, pleasant feel to the workplace. Clean and tidy kitchens and toilets, a good workplace temperature can help people's morale and general well-being while they're working, and help them to feel a bit happier while they're at work. Give people some freedom if you can on how they go about completing work tasks. You might want something done, but if you can give them a little bit of a say in how they get it done, that can actually help them, because not everyone likes to be regimented in the way that they work. Encourage work-life balance as much as you can. Give people a quiet area to go for rest breaks. You don't want people having their sort of tea break in the workshop or their lunch in the workshop. Hopefully you've got a staff restroom, canteen, kitchen, somewhere where they can go to get away from the noise and the dirt and the dust for a period of time. Make sure that any change in the organization is communicated clearly and timely. You don't want rumors spreading, particularly unnecessary rumors. That's just going to cause anxiety and worry amongst people, and it's going to take their mind off of their job. Support those who are clearly struggling. There might be a training need for people that are struggling with their work. They might need some sort of flexible working. Again, communication is key there again, and hopefully your own organizations have got a nice sort of open door culture where people feel they can approach management and have a conversation without any issues. Okay, last bit really here. I've just gone slightly over time, so just going to finish off with this this slide here. In terms of the way forward, or things I think it would be worth considering off the back of this webinar, make sure you've got your risk assessments in order. Risk assessments underpin your whole health and safety management system and all your policies and procedures. You need to understand what your significant hazards are and demonstrate that you've assessed them and put in place adequate risk controls. You need to control risks so far as is reasonably practicable. It's an HSE buzzword, but you need to balance the benefits of risk reduction from control measures versus their cost in terms of time, effort, money, inconvenience. So there's a kind of a cost benefit analysis to be done when we're thinking about risk controls, and it's something that Sutton can give you some further, more specific advice on, but you need to make sure that your risk controls are reasonably practicable. Staff training, important. Make sure that you have a training plan for staff, not just a quick induction. Make sure that they are trained on the hazards that they're likely to be facing. So, you know, if they're going to be doing work at height, if they're going to be using chemicals, think about COSH. If they're using electrical equipment, maybe some electrical safety training, fire safety training for sure, lone working, sometimes for people that are out doing mobile repair work and that sort of thing. Make sure you've got a training plan is the key point there, and also evidence of the content of training that's delivered and evidence that staff have received and understood it. Make sure you deal with the basics effectively. Housekeeping, general tidiness, keep the kind of front-facing parts of the business in good order. If you do get a visit from an HSE inspector, if they see something isn't quite right with just general housekeeping, or maybe your statutory documentation like a health and safety policy statement or your employer's liability certificate isn't on display, little things like that, if they're not right, might cause them to think, oh, hang on a minute, if I haven't got that right, what else is going on here? They might start digging a little bit further. So make sure you do the basics, well, and present a positive outlook for the business to other people that are visiting. Make sure you have safe systems of work for tasks and processes that present a significant risk of injury or ill health. Important that people, if they're using a piece of machinery or doing a task like changing a gearbox, for example, that there is a devised step-by-step safe way of doing that task that everyone is aware of and follows. Make sure you're getting competent advice. If you haven't got someone within the organization that is health and safety qualified, health and safety knowledgeable when it comes to managing health and safety day to day, then talk to someone outside the business that can give you the information you need and kind of set you on a path to effective health and safety. And what I would tend to do is set yourself some goals and say, look, you know, we're going to create a budget for dealing with health and safety, whatever that's going to be per annum. But think about the savings you might be able to make. Just maybe have a look at your accident record, think about the accidents you've had over the last year or so, and think about what they actually cost you in terms of all the time and inconvenience that flowed from them. And if you can quantify that in financial terms, then I think you can make a good case for actually spending some money proactively on health and safety, because you'll see the savings that you can actually make longer term. Okay, so that's me. I've rattled through that. I've managed to, I've just gone over the 40 minutes, but hopefully I've given you some food for thought there. Yeah, happy to take any questions. back to you, Ben.
That was great, Martin. Thank you ever so much for that. I hope everyone found that really useful and can take some great things away from that. So yes, conscious of time, but we have had a few questions come in, so I will ask those. So the first one we've got, Martin, is we have dozens and dozens of different tasks and processes in our workshops and probably hundreds of tools and machines. Are we really expected to do a risk assessment for every one of them?
Okay, no is the answer. The simple answer. You've got to focus on the significant hazards in the workplace. The HSE have been at pains to say they don't want organisations to get bogged down in trivial risks. I made reference earlier on to the kettle in the kitchen. You don't need to do a risk assessment for making a cup of tea in the kitchen. It's focusing on those tasks and those pieces of machinery and equipment that are most likely to cause injury or ill health. So focus on the significant hazards. Don't get bogged down in the trivial things, is my advice.
That's great, thank you. So the second question we've got is, what can we do if employees choose to ignore their training or our safety rules? How can we be responsible if a member of staff chooses to do something stupid and hurts themselves?
Yeah, I get asked this quite a lot, actually, when we're trying to work with organizations to kind of improve the safety of their workplace. They say, well, employees, they're not wearing their PPE, they're not putting their gloves on, they're not doing this, they're not following the safe system of work, etc. At the end of the day, as the employer, you've got a duty of care towards the employees, and you're the people responsible for ensuring health and safety in the workplace. And you've got to make sure there's monitoring of how people are working and that people are supervised. So you need to be able to spot when people are breaking the rules or trying to cut corners and call that out and say to people, look, you shouldn't be doing that. And if they repeat that behavior, then escalate it accordingly through the disciplinary procedure. And if it ends up in a verbal warning or it goes beyond that, then so be it. But that's how you try and cement a good positive safety culture, by making sure that those negative behaviors don't get allowed to be unaddressed.
Sure, no, that's great, thank you. Our second to last one we've got is, how often do we need to do refresher training?
Generally speaking, every 3 years or so is good. It does depend on the particular subject in question. But for general workplace health and safety, I think every 3 years is pretty good. Obviously on induction as well for new starters. But I mean, manual handling is a good example. I would give some induction training to new employees, irrespective of their previous employment. And then perhaps every 3 years or so, run a session just to follow up and give people a reminder of how they should be working, and to reinforce the correct behaviors, because it's just like driving a car, isn't it? You learn to drive, you take your test, you get your license, and then a few years down the line, bad habits can develop. It's human nature, and it's important in the workplace that we just keep a tab on how people are working. So yeah, every 3 years or so is a reasonable rule of thumb for general refresher training.
That's great, and thank you. As we've been talking, we've had a couple more questions coming, which I think are really good, so I will ask those. So it kind of links, I suppose, to the refresher training, is I suppose that's something that we can help with at Sutton Winston. But what, from terms of risk management, what can Sutton Winston do for us?
Well, I mean, pretty much anything you like in terms of health and safety. I mean, we help to develop risk assessments. We can help you with your workplace risk assessments. We can design, draft policies, procedures, safe systems of work. We do a lot of training with organisations. We're an IOSH accredited trainer, IOSH being the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, and we deliver their nationally recognised courses for managers and supervisors, so Managing Safely, their flagship 4-day course, and we've developed our own courses for specific subjects like machinery safety, COSH, fire, and we've built a whole number of courses on very sort of niche areas, upon request, really. So yeah, we can help with all of that. We do workplace inspections as well, and audits of sites. We kind of act as a a second pair of eyes, I guess, for organisations that would like the benefit of another party from outside coming in and giving an assessment of the quality of their workplace safety. Because sometimes if you're working in a particular workplace day in, day out, you become a bit blasé about the true nature of what's going on around you, and you can kind of take for granted some of the hazards that are there. So going in as an outside person, obviously with experience across the motor trade as well. So I've seen a number of different organizations, I can kind of benchmark where people are in the grand scheme of things compared to their peers, which often motor traders don't always know because they work in, to some extent, they work in a bubble. And it can be helpful for them to know how other people are doing things and what works for other organizations.
No, that's great. I hope that answers your question. So the final one we've had in is we have accidents within our workplace and some do incur injury, which causes the employee to be absent from work for a few days. However, my business allows employees to take annual leave. This is then masking the absence and makes it difficult for me to get safety improvements implemented as the business doesn't see the employee downtime, etc. How can I convince senior management to get on board?
Good question. And with the difficulty in convincing senior management, people on the board, you have to try and go in with a financial case for health and safety. And I alluded to this earlier, but if you can demonstrate what the accidents are costing the business in financial terms, and it's possible to do that. I mean, obviously the direct costs of a broken machine, for example, or someone being off work for a couple of days, you can kind of quantify that fairly easily. But if you could then think about all the time and effort that's associated in dealing with the aftermath of the accident, try and put a pound sign on that, and do that for other similar accidents. And you can work out over the last 6 months, we've incurred these costs, and you can go to your FD and say, right, we've had these costs in the business in the last 6 months. I'm putting a case to you to spend X amount on these particular health and safety measures, whether it's training or whether it's new safety barriers or signage or training up fire wardens or whatever it might be. You can make a case for it, because if people on the board, particularly an FD, can see, oh yeah, I can see that makes sense. We're spending £4,000 there. We're going to save £8,000. It's kind of a no-brainer. If you can make a financial case for it, then there's a good chance that you're going to get it signed off.
No, that's great. Perfect. No, thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question and for you all for joining today's session. That's all that we've got time for. That's all the questions answered. So I hope you really enjoyed the webinar today. As I said earlier, we will be following up tomorrow with an email with the recording of today's session. So please feel free to share that with colleagues, anybody you think might also be interested in hearing what Martin's had to say today. And we'll also be sharing Martin's contact details. So if you do want to get in touch for more information, if you think of anything else and you want to ask a question, or you'd like our help in improving your risk management in your workplace, then please don't hesitate to get in touch.